We don't think that educational researchers who draw on psychoanalytical perspectives would recognise our approach as being particularly psychoanalytical, and it isn't a description that either of us would normally apply to our work, and people who know any of the work that we've been involved in would recognise that too, I think. It's not a usual description of our approach to mathematical education research. But we do see overlapping concerns and mutual areas of interest with our kind of more the approaches that we are more familiar with, and psychoanalytic perspectives. At base, I suppose, one of our interests is in how people make sense of their experiences in the world. And in this, we do find room for giving attention to the emotional, the psychic, the inner worlds, as well as the social and the cultural and the political. So I suppose that's where we're finding an overlap with psychoanalytical perspectives. And one way into these concerns where we feel that there is some resonance is through the idea of storying the self. I mean, elsewhere Mark has drawn on ideas from Hannah Arendt and her ideas of authoring the self, which are perhaps there's some kind of connection there. And the idea of us all being engaged in identity work, where identity work as being productive. It's by doing identity work we do produce in some sense ourselves, or our sense of self, and so on. And we talk ourselves into being through such identity work. So those are the kinds of areas where we think there's an overlap between things that we're interested in and a psychoanalytic perspective.
Okay. So one starting point is why this story? Why bring this story? And when I say this story, this constructed story, which is called Louise in Mathematics. Why bring it here, and why record it anyway, and go to the trouble of working with, interviewing Louise in the first place, creating a monologue, writing it down. Well, one way of answering that, a little sort of tale of synchronicity. Whilst I was doing some preparation for this, and I was going back and pulling off some of the material and looked what I'd written about this at some time in the past, went downstairs to the printer and came back up, and two of these primary students were going downstairs, and as I passed them, I overheard them one saying to the other, you know, I can't do it, I just freeze, I've always been like that with maths. And what came back in that moment was the memory of actually how I met the person who here was called Louise, who initially volunteered to take part in some interviews around how she felt when they were introducing these online numeracy tests, and about how angry she felt and so on. And I interviewed her about that, and it was quite a constructed propagandist type interview where she definitely had her point to make, and we were doing the work anyway in order to make a point, which wasn't successful, and you know, the things came in, and then yeah, and then at the end of the interview she said some really interesting things about some of the stuff that then came up later about being in the fog and the numbers running away from her, and I said I'd really like to talk to you again, and she agreed to do that. And again, I was interviewing a primary student recently about her experience of learning groups, and at the end again turns the tape recorder off, and she starts talking about, oh, now I've got to go and see another member of staff, and he's going to help me about these numeracy tests. So one of the reasons for saying that and for retelling those stories is that this stuff is very live, that often we forget that. You know, often we forget that there are people walking around whose mathematical worlds and whose life worlds are being affected by their experience of school mathematics daily.
Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to turn to the research artefact that Mark's already spoken about and which you had available beforehand. And Mark's going to spend some time talking about that and drawing out ideas from it. As you'll probably be aware, the artefact and the thinking around it is drawing very much on Mark's doctoral work, and I just want to acknowledge that and say that this is the kind of key contribution from this joint presentation, is that it's work that Mark has done previously. One of the things we're interested in you having in the back of your mind when you're thinking about that research artifact, that story, as well as the particular themes that Mark is going to draw out, is this idea of some research artifacts operating as public resources, which is an idea from John Nixon and other people, where there are stories, we're experimenting with the idea that there are stories which it is important to tell, because those stories can then operate in the public arena and become part of what is publicly acknowledged and known. So it's a kind of idea about another purpose for research artifacts that operate as stories. Anyway, so the bulk of the presentation now is over to you.
Okay, so and one thing methodologically is that you've been presented with a large piece of text rather than a breaking up. So to come and present this, other than actually speaking the whole of the story, in some ways is against what my intention is in terms of presenting that way in the first place. But nonetheless, there's a constriction of time. And also, her story speaks for itself in many ways. And she is both typical and atypical in a number of ways. Typical in that the picture of alienation, of pressure, isolation, frustration, shame, anger, sadness, boredom, fear, silence, being silenced, all of those different aspects of her mathematical reality have been recorded and have been spoken about in many ways. Where she's atypical, perhaps, is that she's able to put that together and actually speak that story perhaps more eloquently than often people do when they've experienced mathematics. So I'm not going to sort of go through point by point and sort of point to where some of those different emotional qualities, etc., or themes come up in it. I'm just going to highlight a number of them, and there are many others, and you may well have seen and read and picked out things which felt were more important to you, and that's actually part of the point of the producing the story in the way that it is. Firstly, there's a pervading sense of struggle that goes all the way through the way she describes. And when I talk about struggle, yes, she talks at one point, she says, I was always bored or desperately struggling. So there is that sense of struggling with the mathematics, but there is more important than that. There is that sense of struggling with making sense of her experience. And I think Hilary at the end will come back to that question of, which is an open question for us, around agency in that situation and that sense of authoring the self in that. And I think we both switch between it, sort of quite a despairing and sometimes more hopeful view of what's possible.